A quiet murmur filled the crowded terminal. As the veteran slowly made his way to the gate, the weight of his worn leather duffel bag, seeming heavier than it should have been, the soft tap of his boots against the tile floor, echoing through the bustling crowd. But he didn't notice he was lost in his own thoughts, the kind that often followed him since his time in service. Each step he took felt like a battle of its own. He stood tall with a dignity earned in places most people would never know, but today something was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that people were staring at him. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe it was the faded jacket. He wore the one that had seen too many winters and carried memories that refused to fade, but whatever it was, it gnawed at him. As he walked past the flight attendants stationed at the gate, he noticed one of them glancing up from her clipboard. She was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair tied back neatly, and a smile that looked practiced, like it had been perfected for moments. Just like this, her eyes briefly locked with his, but only for a second before she quickly looked away. The veteran felt a wave of discomfort wash over him, but he tried to brush it off. He had been through worse, and was used to the stares that followed him everywhere. He went the ones that saw the uniform first, and then the man underneath. But this time it felt different. This woman wasn't like the others. She seemed to look at him like she was sizing him up, judging him without a word. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as he settled into his seat on the plane. The noise of the passengers around him faded as he let out a long breath, closing his eyes and trying to relax, but the unease lingered like a shadow. The woman's face appeared in his mind again. She was standing near the front of the cabin, now checking on passengers, her eyes scanning each row, like she was looking for something specific. When she reached his row, she paused for a moment, as though debating whether or not to approach him. He felt her gaze before she even spoke, her voice soft at first, but with a coldness that sent a shiver down his spine. "Sir, is there anything I can help you with today?" She asked, her words polite, but the tone didn't match. It felt rehearsed, like she had said it 100 times before without truly meaning it. He looked up at her, seeing the professional smile, but something about the way she held herself made him uneasy. Her eyes never left his as she waited for a response. There was no warmth in her words, no kindness, just an emptiness that lingered in the air. "No, thank you," he said quietly, feeling his stomach twist. But he didn't want to make a scene. He just wanted to get to his destination without any trouble. But as she turned to walk away, he noticed her glance back at him. For a split second, the expression on her face unreadable, but sharp, like she was judging him in some way he couldn't quite understand. The veteran tried to ignore it, sinking deeper into his seat and focusing on the soft hum of the engines. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. It followed him like a shadow, growing longer with each passing minute as the flight began its climb into the sky. The veteran sat back in his seat, trying to shake off the strange feeling, but it clung to him like a fog in the morning that refused to lift. The plane was now cruising high above the clouds, but the tightness in his chest wouldn't ease. He glanced around at the other passengers, all lost in their own worlds, some asleep with their heads resting against the windows, others chatting in hushed voices. The hum of the engines was a constant backdrop, but it did nothing to soothe him. He kept his eyes forward, trying not to make eye contact with anyone else, especially had the flight attendant, who had been watching him like a hawk. He could feel her presence, even when she wasn't close. It was as if she was always there in the corner of his mind. And when she came back down the aisle a few minutes later, she didn't look at anyone else, just him, her gaze sharp and piercing, as though she was waiting for him to do something. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and that's when it happened, the moment that made everything feel off balance. The flight attendant stopped right in front of him, not saying anything, just standing there, her eyes never leaving his. Her smile had faded completely, now replaced by something colder, something he couldn't quite place. "Sir," she said, after what felt like an eternity. Her voice was still polite, but now it held a certain edge. "Would you mind staying seated and fastening your seatbelt?" He looked up at her surprised and confused. The seatbelt sign had already been on for a while. So why was she making such a big deal out of it? His heart raced as he tried to figure out if he had missed something. Was it his age? Was she picking on him because of the way he looked? Or was there something more to it that he couldn't understand? "I'm fine," he said quietly, trying to ease the tension. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted a smooth flight. He didn't want to cause any problems. But her eyes didn't soften. They stayed fixed on him in a way that made him feel small and helpless. "I'm going to have to insist you stay in your seat." Her voice was firmer now, sharper, like an order. And when she took a step closer to him, he could feel the coldness radiating off of her, like she was about to do something he wasn't prepared for. The veteran's mind raced. He had seen this before, people who treated him like he didn't belong, like he was just a relic from a time that had passed, people who didn't understand or care about what he had been through. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the flight attendant spoke again, her words like ice cutting through the air. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something else in them, something dark and unspoken. And that's when he realized that this wasn't about a seatbelt at all. It was something else entirely, something he didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could get a word out, he felt a tap on his shoulder from the woman sitting in the row behind him. She had been watching everything unfold, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. The veteran turned slightly, catching her eye for a moment. She quickly looked down at her phone as if to pretend she wasn't watching, but he saw the video. She was recording her screen, just barely visible under the dim light of the overhead reading lamps. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone had seen it, someone had caught the whole exchange on camera, and in that moment, everything changed. The flight attendant didn't know it yet, but her actions had been documented for the world to see. The veteran's heart began to race as the reality of the situation sank in. He had seen it before, the way people acted when they thought they could get away with anything, treating him like an outsider, like his experiences didn't matter. But now it was different. Now there was evidence, and as he glanced back at the woman behind him, he saw the faintest reflection of the screen on her phone. The recording was happening. His mind spun for a moment. Should he confront her? Should he ask her to stop filming? Or just let it play out? He wasn't sure. But there was no turning back now. He could feel the heat rise in his chest. The anger that had been simmering since the first cold look the flight attendant gave him was now boiling over. She wasn't done with him, yet he could feel it the way she lingered just a few feet away, her body stiff with purpose. He tried to calm himself, but the frustration only grew. His fingers twitched and clenched against the armrest, his thoughts racing back to the way she spoke to him, so cold, so dismissive. "Sir, I've already asked you to remain seated." Her voice rang out again, sharper than before. It wasn't a request anymore, it was an order. And it didn't matter that he was a man who had served his country. She wasn't giving him the respect he deserved, and that stung more than anything else. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off before he could say a word. "Please do not make this difficult." The words came out like a warning, like she had dealt with people like him before and wasn't afraid to put him in his place. The veteran's eyes narrowed as the realization hit him harder than the words themselves. It wasn't just about the seatbelt or the rules, it was about power. It was about her wanting to control the situation, wanting to humiliate him in front of others to prove that she was the one in charge, that he was just another old man in her way. His mind flashed to a time long ago when the world seemed much simpler, but also much harsher, a time when he didn't hesitate to stand up for what was right. But now the fight felt different, like the rules had changed, and his body wasn't what it used to be. But something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the need to stand up to injustice. No matter how small or big, he had fought battles before. This would be no different. He wasn't going to back down, not now. He took a slow breath, his hand resting on the armrest, As he turned to face her this time, his voice was calm but firm. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his words cutting through the tension that hung heavy in the air. The flight attendant's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, please," she said, as she began to step closer to him again. But this time something was different. The way her eyes darted nervously toward the back of the plane showed that she wasn't as confident as before. The shift in power was subtle, but it was there. But then something else happened, something unexpected. The woman sitting behind him, who had been recording everything, suddenly stood up from her seat, the quiet click of her phone screen stopping the flight attendant in her tracks. She held up her phone in front of her, and with a calm yet determined voice said, "I have everything on video." The veteran felt a rush of relief mixed with disbelief. As he turned to look at her, her face was resolute, her eyes meeting the flight attendant's without fear. She knew what was at stake, and now so did the entire plane. The flight attendant froze for a second, her face pale. As she looked back at the woman holding the phone, her bravado shattered in an instant, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile, trying to regain control of the situation. But the damage had been done, and it was too late. The flight attendant stood frozen, her eyes locked on the phone screen as if she could somehow will it to disappear. But the woman with the camera wasn't backing down, her hand steady. As she held it up for all to see, the entire cabin was silent now. The low hum of the engines, the only sound that filled the air, but it felt deafening, like the calm before a storm. The veteran watched her closely, his heart racing. But it wasn't fear, it was something else, something that had been missing for so long, the feeling that he wasn't alone in this fight, that he wasn't just a forgotten relic of a bygone era waiting to be overlooked. The realization hit him like a wave, and he felt the weight of the years start to lift just a little. The flight attendant's eyes darted back and forth from the phone to the passengers sitting nearby, her face now a mask of frustration and panic beneath the surface. But she didn't dare speak, not yet, as if waiting for the right moment to regain control of the situation. She took a step back and then another, as though trying to put some space between herself and the growing crowd of people who had started to take notice of what was happening. It was no longer just about the veteran, or her actions were now on display for all to see, and the quiet murmurs of the passengers around them began to swell. The woman with the phone didn't back down. She was standing tall, now her expression calm but firm, as she continued to hold up the camera for everyone to see. No one said a word, but the shift in the air was palpable, like the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the flight attendant broke the silence, her voice tight and clipped as she spoke. "I'm going to need you to put that phone away." But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't lower the camera, not for a second, and the veteran could see the faintest tremor in the flight attendant's hands now. She was losing her grip on the situation, and there was no going back. The veteran's mind raced as he watched the exchange unfold. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. But it wasn't fear, it was anger, not for himself, but for the way she had treated him, for the way she had treated all the veterans he had known who had been overlooked and forgotten by a world that moved on too quickly. He wasn't just a passenger on a plane. He was a man who had earned the right to be treated with dignity. But that was all slipping away in the moment. The flight attendant's cool exterior was cracking, and her attempt to intimidate him had backfired in front of everyone who had been watching in silence. Another passenger in the back of the cabin spoke up, their voice cutting through the tension. "You can't treat people like that," they said, their tone calm but firm. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the veteran could feel the weight of them, the support from the passengers around him growing stronger by the second. The flight attendant flinched as if struck by the words, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, like she wasn't sure how to respond to what was happening anymore. The power dynamic had shifted, and she was no longer in control. The veteran's eyes didn't leave her now. He could see the cracks in her composure, the way her breathing had become uneven, the way her forced smile had faltered. But he didn't speak, he didn't need to, the moment had passed, and the passengers had already made their judgment. The woman behind him lowered her phone slowly, but the damage was done. The flight attendant's actions were now documented, and the world would soon know what had happened here. The flight attendant took a step back, her face pale, but her eyes still scanning the room, desperately searching for a way to regain control of the situation. She could feel the weight of the gazes on her from every direction. It wasn't just the veteran anymore. It was everyone around her who had seen the truth in that moment, seen how she had tried to intimidate a man who didn't deserve it. The silence was deafening now. The quiet murmurs that had started to spread among the passengers grew louder every second, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. The veteran sat still in his seat, his gaze unwavering, as he watched the flight attendant stumble over her words, her mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find something to say, but no words came. She had no choice but to turn away. She was losing control, and she knew it. The passengers had already made their judgments. Her attempt to keep the upper hand had failed miserably, and it was clear that she wasn't going to intimidate him any longer. But the veteran wasn't satisfied. He had seen this too many times before, the way people tried to cover up their mistakes when they thought they could get away with them. As the flight attendant made her way toward the front of the cabin, the veteran felt the sting of the injustice still burning deep inside of him. He didn't ask for this attention. He didn't want to be made an example of, but now he couldn't let it go, not after everything he had been through, not after the way she had treated him, like he was invisible, like he didn't matter. A voice from a few rows behind broke the silence again. This time it was a man in his 40s who had been watching everything unfold with quiet intensity. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice low but firm, and with those 3 words the entire plane seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Everyone had been waiting for someone to speak up, waiting for someone to challenge the flight attendant, and now it was happening. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as he walked toward the flight attendant, who was now standing at the front of the plane, her back turned, as she pretended to busy herself with the overhead compartments. "You don't get to treat people like that," the man continued, his voice gaining strength as he neared her. "Not on this plane, not today." The veteran watched from his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, as the scene before him played out. The flight attendant's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn to face him. She just stood there, her hands shaking slightly as if trying to compose herself. The man didn't back down. He stood his ground, and the passengers around him began to murmur in agreement, nodding their heads or whispering their support. He wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't just about one veteran anymore. It was about respect for everyone on that plane. The veteran took a deep breath, his chest tight, as he finally stood up from his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let the flight attendant get away with it, not this time. The flight attendant stiffened as she felt his presence behind her. Without turning, she said quietly, "Sir, please sit down. This is not the time for this." But it wasn't just him standing now. It was everyone who had been silently watching this unfold. The veteran stood tall, and with a voice that carried across the cabin, he spoke his words clear and steady. "I've been through too much to stay silent anymore. We all deserve better than this." The room went quiet for a moment, and then the murmurs began again, louder this time. The passengers were no longer just observers. They were participants in this moment. The veteran's words had awakened something in them, a need for justice, and it was spreading like wildfire. The flight attendant's back stiffened even more as she finally turned to face him, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. But the veteran didn't look away. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he was being seen. The flight attendant stood frozen as the veteran's words echoed through the cabin. Her eyes flickered nervously around the room like a cornered animal seeking an escape. But there was nowhere to run. She had miscalculated everything, every move, every word. She thought she had the power. She thought she could intimidate him. But now the truth was out in the open, and the weight of it was suffocating her. The other passengers had started to shift in their seats, some leaning forward, some standing up. The room felt smaller now as the voices began to rise, a chorus of quiet murmurs building into something louder, something undeniable. The veteran stood there, unwavering, his gaze locked on the flight attendants now, and she couldn't look away no matter how hard she tried. "You're embarrassing yourself." The man from earlier spoke up again, his voice strong, his words cutting through the tension like a knife, and the passengers around him nodded in agreement. The flight attendant's face reddened with a mixture of frustration and humiliation. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. It was as if the air had been sucked from her lungs, and she was left gasping for control. But the more she tried to regain it, the more it slipped through her fingers. The veteran's chest tightened as he stood there facing her. He wasn't backing down this time. He wasn't the quiet observer he had been at the beginning of the flight. He was a man who had seen enough of this kind of treatment, and he wasn't going to let it slide anymore, not today, not after everything. He took a step forward, his voice low but steady. "You don't get to treat people like that," he said again, his words carrying the weight of years of experience, years of being overlooked and disrespected by people who thought they knew better than him. The flight attendant's eyes darted to the floor for a brief second before snapping back up to his face. She opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted once more, this time by another passenger, a woman sitting near the front of the plane. "I've seen what she did to him too." The woman said, her voice trembling but firm. She stood up and looked directly at the flight attendant, her eyes filled with fire. "You don't treat people like that. You don't treat anyone like that." The flight attendant's face twisted with something between anger and disbelief. She couldn't understand how this was happening, how everything she'd had tried to do to assert control was crumbling in front of her eyes. She glanced around the cabin at the faces staring back at her, all watching her every move like a crowd waiting for the verdict. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step back. She was no longer in control, and she knew it. The passengers had taken charge. The support for the veteran was palpable. Now they weren't just witnesses, they were allies, and that was a power the flight attendant had underestimated. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean," she started to say, but the veteran didn't let her finish, his voice louder, now filled with a quiet rage. "You didn't mean to treat me like that. You didn't mean to humiliate me in front of everyone." His words hit her like a slap, but there was no turning back now. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. It felt like the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for the next move, waiting for the flight attendant to either face the consequences or try to save herself. But deep down she knew it was too late. She took another step back, but it wasn't enough. The tension had already shifted in the cabin, and now everyone knew exactly what had happened. The truth was out, and no amount of apologies or excuses could erase the damage that had been done. The veteran felt a sense of relief wash over him as the support from the other passengers continued to grow. They weren't afraid to speak up. They weren't afraid to stand by him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible anymore. He didn't feel forgotten. The flight attendant took another shaky step back, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if she couldn't catch her breath. The words she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. Her hands were still trembling by her sides, but no apology was coming. Her face was flushed with embarrassment. Her pride had been shattered in front of the entire plane. But it wasn't just her who was feeling the heat now. It was everyone who had been watching, as the power dynamic shifted so quickly that no one could have predicted it. The veteran stood firm, his eyes never leaving hers, his body tense. But calm. The man had lived through storms far bigger than this. But even now he could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on him. The cabin was silent once more, the tension so thick you could almost taste it. The whispers had died down, but the eyes of every passenger were on the flight attendant and on him. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, and every second that passed made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. Her eyes darted to the flight deck door, as if she were thinking about running for it. But she couldn't leave, not now, not after everything she had done, not after everything that had been exposed. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant muttered finally, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. But the veteran didn't flinch, he didn't soften, not after the way she had treated him. He knew better than to believe the apology. He had heard it before, from people who thought an apology would make everything go away. But it didn't work like that, not with him, not anymore. "Sorry isn't good enough," he said, his voice steady, his words cutting through the heavy air like a knife. The cabin was so still that the faint hum of the plane's engines seemed deafening now. His words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time, and everyone waited for the next move to come. The flight attendant's face twisted again with a flash of anger, but she quickly smothered it with a forced smile, as if trying to reassert some control over the situation. But the cracks in her composure were clear for all to see. The veteran's steady gaze made sure of that. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice trembling, but trying to sound authoritative again, trying to regain some semblance of power. But her words fell flat against the weight of the truth her earlier actions had exposed. She wasn't fooling anyone, not anymore. The man from earlier, who had stood up in support of the veteran, stepped forward again, his voice low but firm. "Doing your job doesn't mean treating people like that. You didn't just ask him to stay seated. You humiliated him. You treated him like he didn't matter." The flight attendant's jaw clenched as she tried to find words, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted around the cabin, and she could feel the stares of the passengers pressing down on her, each one holding her accountable for what had happened, and the silence stretched on as she realized she was completely alone. She turned quickly, her face now pale with panic, as she moved toward the front of the plane, as if hoping to escape the confrontation. But before she could reach the galley, another voice rang out from the back of the plane. This time it was a woman's voice, steady and unwavering. "You can't just walk away from this," she said, her tone calm but firm. The flight attendant froze mid-step, her body tense, as if she had been caught in a trap. But the moment had already passed. No amount of running could hide what had happened here. It was done. The entire plane had seen the truth, and now the passengers were speaking out loud what they had been thinking from the beginning. The veteran watched her. He didn't say a word, his eyes following her every movement. The situation wasn't over yet, but he could feel it slipping away from her. She had underestimated the passengers. She had underestimated him. And now she was facing the consequences of her actions. The flight attendant stood at the front of the plane, her body trembling now with a mix of fear and anger. The realization that she couldn't control the situation anymore sank in deeper with every passing second. She could feel the eyes of every passenger boring into her back, the weight of their judgment, heavier than anything she had ever experienced. Her forced smile was gone, now replaced by a mask of frustration and regret. But it was too late to undo what she had done. The veteran remained in his seat, his gaze unwavering, his posture steady, as if he had already won the battle before it had even ended. The words of support from the other passengers echoed in his mind. They were with him. They were standing with him against the injustice that had unfolded on this plane. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. She knew she couldn't just walk away. She knew that her actions were no longer just a small mistake to be swept under the rug. No, she had made herself the center of a confrontation that no one would forget any time soon, and the truth was she had crossed a line that could not be undone. The murmurs from the back of the plane continued to ripple through the cabin, the tension thick in the air like a fog that refused to lift, and as the flight attendant turned to face the flight deck door, she could hear the voices calling out to her, the quiet but steady calls for accountability, and she realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escaping it anymore. One of the flight crew members had arrived at the front, now standing just behind the flight attendant, her presence silent but powerful as she took in the scene. Before her she had been briefed about the situation by the other passengers, and she knew exactly what had happened. She didn't need to hear it again to understand that the flight attendant had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. Without a word, the new crew member stepped forward, her eyes briefly meeting the veteran's as she nodded in silent acknowledgement of the support he had received from the other passengers, and she turned to the flight attendant, who was now visibly shaking her hands, fidgeting at her sides in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "We're going to have to ask you to step aside," the new flight attendant said, her voice calm but firm. There was no question in her tone, no room for negotiation. It was clear that this was the end for the flight attendant who had caused so much turmoil for the passengers and the veteran. The veteran could feel a rush of relief, but also a strange sense of vindication as he watched the scene unfold. He had been through so much in his life, and it was rare for him to feel that kind of satisfaction. But in this moment, as the flight attendant's fate was sealed, he knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up for himself and for everyone who had ever been mistreated in silence. The flight attendant glanced one last time around the cabin, her eyes searching for any sign of support from the passengers. But there was none left, not any more, and as she was escorted off the plane by the other flight crew members, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The shame was unbearable, but there was no one left to blame but herself. The veteran sank back into his seat, his eyes closing for a brief moment. As he exhaled slowly, the battle was over, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had won. He had stood up to the